Hello and welcome to the So You Want to Farm in West Virginia webinar series. This session is all about soil health, and my name is Emily Wells and I am an Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent with WVU Extension Service, and I am based in Jefferson County. In order to truly understand soil health, we need to take it back and understand what the soil is, how it was made, and what constitutes a healthy soil. So soils are made of air, water, decayed plant and animal residue, which we refer to as organic matter, and minerals. The minerals are the elements that help feed the plants. Soil is formed from rock broken down over thousands of years, and it is a very precious resource, so we must conserve what we have. The soil is formed by means of a physical and chemical weathering process caused by living organisms, the topography, the climate, the rain and the weather, and most importantly, the time. It actually takes about 500 to 1,000 years to form just 1 inch of topsoil, so that really kind of reinforces our point that what soil that we have, it's important to take care of it and important to build up that soil health over the years, not only because it's a very important resource to conserve, but it also helps our farming operation if we have a very strong soil health, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Getting a little bit further into what exactly is soil, soil naturally forms in layers from the bottom up. I think we all kind of know that the center of our earth is rock, and over time that rock breaks down and forms what we refer to as soil. In agriculture, we really focus on the top horizon. That's where our roots of our plants grow. That's where most of the minerals are. It's the most nutrient dense. That's where we add more minerals to help the plants grow. And the layers below that have various degrees of formation over time, because the soil forms from the bottom up, as you can see from that picture there on the slide. But again, we're really just going to be talking about the top layer, the top soil, as you'll hear it referred to. And soil will work for the farm if the farmer feeds the soil. So if you're not giving anything to the soil, you shouldn't really expect to get anything back from it. And that's just one of the principles of good soil health and healthy soil practices that we'll really talk about here today. Soil health is not an overnight process. It takes years of good farming practices to build up a healthy soil that's rich in that organic matter we had talked about. A healthy soil is one that's going to be soft. It's going to be slightly damp, a little bit darker in color, and when you start working with that soil, you'll notice it's home to worms and other organisms. It's easy to forget that soil is a living body. It's just teeming with not only worms or bugs or any other different types of things we'll find in the ground, but it also has microbes and other sorts of beneficial organisms that we can't even see, and they're in such abundance that even to this day, science is not entirely sure about the science behind all of the organisms that live within the soil. Organic matter is a huge component. An ideal soil is made up of about 5% organic matter, and that comes with time. We'll talk a little bit about practices on how to build up a better soil health, and when we talk about building up soil health and preserving soil health, we're talking about helping to build up organic matter, which means that more nutrients are going to be stored within the soil, more nutrients are going to be readily available for plants, and then those plants are going to grow bigger and they're going to grow better, and they're going to impact the farm and benefit the farmer in the long run. Touching more upon the many benefits of a healthy soil, producing better crops and higher yields automatically translates into dollars for the farmer. Every practice and every bit of time that's spent in building up a healthy soil pays off well into the long run. When you receive higher yields, that means dollars back into your wallet through greater sales. This also can translate into reducing your production costs. If you have a healthy soil, you're not going to need to spend the time or the labor putting additives on the soil to bring it up to a optimal nutrient level. This also means you're not going to have to buy those inputs as well. Your soil already has a powerhouse of nutrients stored for you, at greater than optimal levels. If you have a healthy soil, it's going to keep those nutrients for longer and help pay off for each growing season year after year. A healthy soil with a lot of organic matter also protects against drought. A healthy soil is going to store more water. Water storage is important because not only does the water helps to release the nutrients to the plant root, and if water is seeping down within the soil, that means it's not running off across the soil, which is a component of erosion. If the soil is not healthy enough to intake that water, if it just runs across the land, it might take some of the top layer with it. And we already know that soil is a very precious resource. And that's just one component that we can take to help preserve our natural resources. A few steps that you as a farmer can take to improve soil health for the long term. The first is to keep the soil covered as much as possible. Soil erosion is a huge issue. We talked about how long it really takes for a little bit of topsoil to form. So when that wind or that rain comes on that bare soil and takes it away from your farm, that's just a little bit of soil that adds up to make a huge difference over the years. If that soil is otherwise going to be bare, we'll talk about some practices you can do to keep it covered and reduce the erosion, as well as offering some nutritional benefits to the soil. Disturbing the soil as little as possible is also a practice. I'm not saying that everybody needs to convert to no-till, but if there is a situation when you can keep from disturbing that soil, that helps maintain the soil structure, which helps retain water, and also helps to keep the soil health on the long term. Keeping plants growing throughout the year to feed the soil, that kind of goes back to keeping the soil covered as much as possible, even if it's not a crop that you will particularly be harvesting or it's not something that you can eat or sell. Keeping it on the soil will help to reduce erosion as well as offer some added nutrients back into the soil that next season's crop can then use. And maintaining plant and animal species diversity, this helps to keep diseases and insects down. If you have a wide host of plants, this is not only a good agricultural practice because if a disease comes through and wipes out all of one crop, all of your income is not solely based on that one particular crop. You have other crops to then rely on for that year's revenue. But maximizing your plant and animal species, keeping a diverse farm also helps the soil health. It helps the plant health because it helps to keep diseases at bay as well as insects down. What one insect is attracted to as a plant, another plant might repel that particular insect, and that's just one example of how maximizing diversity can help benefit the ecosystem of your farm. Some of the practices that farmers will adopt to maintain better soil health are cover crops, crop rotations, composting, and no-till or reduced tillage on their land. Cover crops. So a cover crop is an unharvested crop. It is usually planted when the soil would otherwise be left bare, such as late fall through winter. This goes back to one of the principles, one of the steps to better soil health we talked about earlier, when we want to keep the soil covered as much as possible because it's going to prevent erosion. If the soil has a cover onto it, it's not exposed to the elements, so it's not going to get washed away, and all that hard work of maintaining soil health isn't going to get carried away with the wind or the rain. Cover crops have an added benefit of helping to increase soil nutrients and organic matter. Some people will mow them down and incorporate them back into the soil so they decompose naturally and serve as a natural organic substitute to the soil. Other cover crops, people will choose the cover crop based on what type of crop they're going for the next year. So a legume is a type of crop that replenishes nitrogen back into the soil. It's nitrogen fixating. So some farmers will plant a a clover or another type of legume that fixates nitrogen to put more nitrogen back into the soil, so next growing season, before they get ready to plant the corn or something else that's a very heavy nitrogen user, they're not going to have to add as much fertilizer back onto their fields. They're going to have a source that put a little bit more nitrogen in, so they're saving a little bit money. That picture that you'll see there is what they do with the cover crop when they're ready to plant for the next growing season. That farmer is just using a roller crimper to flatten it down on the ground so he can come in with the seeder and put the next year's crop back on top of it. So that cover crop is still serving an additional purpose of keeping the soil covered before the seed starts to germinate and come up and then take the shade and the cover over the land, and the cover crop will slowly decompose over time and put nutrients back into the soil through that manner. Are another common practice. So when we talk about crop rotations, we're talking about refraining from growing the same crop in the same location each year. This is a natural way to help control pests and disease. It kind of confuses them. It gives them on a different schedule, and they don't know to expect tomatoes at that same spot next year. You might be able to fight off your tomato hornworm for a little bit longer in the season. It also encourages nutrients to cycle within the soil. It's a similar practice as cover crop that we just talked about, and replenishing nutrients back into the soil that wouldn't get it from the previous crop. Crop rotations can do the same thing. So over here in Jefferson County, we are a leading producer of corn and soybeans. Corn uses a lot of nitrogen. Soybeans fixate nitrogen back into the soil. So a practice that many of our farmers will adopt, they'll plant corn in one field one year, and then the next year they'll put soybeans on that same field, and then they might switch back to corn. And that rotation helps to maintain a more diverse ecosystem, and it also helps to encourage the nutrients to cycle within the soil, and the nitrogen fixating soybeans helps to reduce inputs for the corn for the following year. Composting is the process that speeds up the decaying of plant and animal residue. This is a very scientific process, so I'm not going to get too much into it. Composting is usually made up of grass clippings, straw, twigs, leaves, livestock manure, woody materials. Certain food can be used in compost in what we call a hot pile. The compost, all these materials are thrown together. You keep them wet enough that it encourages bacteria to start breaking things down a lot quicker than it would in the natural environment. You turn that pile every so often, and it keeps the process going. And after a couple months, a finished compost is going to look and feel exactly like soil, and it's going to have a nutritional benefit to your soil and your plants that you can then spread onto your fields, much like you would do with a fertilizer. So composting might not be for everyone. Depending on the size of your operation, you might not be able to have enough to really put back on all of your fields, but it is an alternative means to promote good, healthy soil. It builds up soil health for the long term, since it's an organic, and when I say organic, I don't necessarily mean certified organic, but more of a natural amendment that you're making on the farm. You're recycling nutrients from the farm back into the farm. It's slow releasing those nutrients onto whatever crop they're being applied to, unlike a typical fertilizer you might buy from southern states. It releases those nutrients quite quickly, and you might not have anything stored left in the soil for the next year. But a compost or something to the like will help build up the soil health more on a long-term basis. And I mentioned we're not going to really get into the specifics of composting because it is a highly scientific process. Depending on the way you compost, it's a lot of trial and error, a lot of practicing things and doing things a certain way to get that finished product in the time that you might like. But if you're interested in more specifics of composting, I recommend that you contact your county extension agent, and they might be able to provide you with fact sheets or more information on how to get started with composting, what stuff's good to put in a compost and what stuff we do not recommend you put into a compost. So no tillage or reduced tillage is the last practice we'll talk about. Tilling, there's always something to be said about reducing the amount that you till because it reduces your mechanical needs. This not only saves you time, but it saves you money in gas and maintenance for that particular tractor if you're not running it as often as you otherwise would be. Reducing your tillage needs helps to improve soil health because excess tillage disturbs the soil's natural want to form structure, and a strongly structured soil helps to increase organic matter. It helps to hold nutrients more in their place. It helps to keep roots, helps roots to spread to a deeper in the soil profile, wider across the soil. So preserving that structure through reduced tillage helps to overall increase the soil health. Soil nutrients. We talk about soil health, we have to really talk about the nutrients themselves. So there's two different categories of nutrients in the soil. There's a whole laundry list of nutrients. I'm not going to list them all to you today. The most important ones you need to know are the macronutrients, and they are the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and potassium. Those are what we call our primary macronutrients. We have secondary macronutrients in sulfur, calcium, and magnesium. There's many different types of micronutrients. Boron and iron are just two of them. They also contribute to healthy soil, meaning if you have a deficiency in boron or you have a deficiency in iron, it's going to impact the overall health of the plant. So when we talk about soil, we really talk that the soil is only as healthy as its weakest elements, but plants have this funny way of telling us if they're lacking something and looking for signs of a nutrient deficiency in your crop. Recognizing what some of those signs look at is your first step towards making sure that your soil has a healthy balance of nutrients. We're going to talk about soil testing here in a little bit. WVU soil test only tests for a small handful of the nutrients. It tests for phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. There's many more like we just talked about on that list. The pictures that you see here on the screen are just a couple examples of what a otherwise healthy plant's going to show us if it's seeing signs of a nutrient deficiency. So that first one, that yellow banding around the center of the leaf of that corn is what a nitrogen deficiency looks like. And there to the other side of the screen, the magnesium displays itself in a completely different way, as do the other elements. So it's very easy to tell if you know what a healthy leaf of your plant looks like. The second that leaf is starting to stray from what healthy is when you need to be thinking if that plant's getting the right amount of nutrients. So since we just talked about soil nutrients, we'll talk about fertilizer, which is our way to add nutrients to our soil when it's lacking them. Fertilizer is typically applied when the plants have the greatest need for it. So a fertilizer for a crop we're going to plant in the spring should be applied in the spring. That plant's development starts to taper off towards the end of the growing season, so it doesn't really have a need for the fertilizer. Fertilizer that we buy is made up of 3 nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It has other nutrients in it, other additives in it, but that is how we make our decision on which fertilizer to buy, based on the levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and based on what our soil is lacking in phosphorus and potassium. Nitrogen is a little bit tricky. We can't really test for nitrogen in a typical soil test, but there are different ways that we use to figure out how much nitrogen we need to put back into the soil. Continuing to talk about fertilizer, different fertilizers have different nutrient levels. They're represented as 3 different numbers on the bag. You can see an example of a typical vegetable garden fertilizer. Those 3 numbers, 10, 10, 10, represent nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in that order. And that 10 means that it's 10% nitrogen, that second 10 means it's 10% phosphorus, and that third 10 means it's 10% potassium. And there's a wide variety of different fertilizers out there. Depending on the type of operation that you have, you're going to be buying different fertilizers. Those with larger agronomic operations, they might plant 1,000 acres of corn. They might be buying a fertilizer that's very heavy in nitrogen, but doesn't have any other types of elements in it because they might not need it. Then the same can be said for any type of crop that you're growing. This 10-10-10 one that we see here is typical to be used in a garden or for vegetables. If you're adopting some of the other practices that we talked about with the crop rotations, you're still replenishing nutrients back into the soil, and ultimately you are going to want to reduce your fertilizer needs because you're going to be getting those nutrients from an additional source, and you're not spending the money that it would take to go out and have to buy fertilizer for your agriculture operation. There's a few different types. The most common of which is a granular method for large fields, where you talk about broadcasting it with a spreader onto the soil surface. Depending on which nutrient is most abundant in that particular fertilizer, you may want to mix it into the soil. Nitrogen, for example, if you're just applying nitrogen to your field, you do not want to mix it into your soil, because once it's mixed into the soil, it starts to go further and further down those soil layers that we had talked about at the beginning of the presentation, which means that it's not going to be readily available for your roots because it's going to go farther below the roots. The type of fertilizer that you buy will typically list recommendations on how you should apply it after it's already on the field, if you should incorporate it or if you should not. Another type of fertilizer is liquid. It's mixed with water and applied to the soil surface. If you're using a liquid fertilizer, it's important that you don't apply it on top of the plants. A couple slides back, we had touched upon how plants show us if they're missing a nutrient. Well, the plant leaves are also going to show us if they're receiving what we call chemical burn from the fertilizer. It's also going to create unhealthy leaves, and then that plant is going to be spending more energy to try and fix those leaves as opposed to growing that plant taller. So now we're going to talk about lime. Lime is an additive that we use to raise the pH of the soil. Different crops prefer different pH levels, so it's important to research the type of crop that you're growing and the type of pH it prefers. Blueberries are a really good example. Blueberries really like acid soils, meaning they like a pH to be quite low, closer to 4 or 5. The optimal soil pH for many crops is much closer to neutral, or between 6.0 to 7.0. We all learned about the pH scale in school. It's acid if it's lower on the scale, and it's alkaline if it's higher on the scale, and our crops typically like to be in the middle of that scale. The best way to tell if your soil needs lime or fertilizer is by getting a soil test. The soil test will give you recommendations on how much lime you need to apply based on your pH, as well as the fertilizer based on the crop you're going to grow, and we will talk about that at the end of the presentation. There are two different types of lime that we use in agriculture: AgLime, which is composed of only calcium carbonate, and dolomite lime, which also contains magnesium in addition to the calcium carbonate. And this is where it gets a little tricky. Soils like a particular ratio of their calcium to magnesium. So if your soil has adequate magnesium levels, the dolomite lime is probably not for you. You're going to want to lean more towards the AgLime to raise your soil pH. And again, your county extension agent can help you make that decision based on your soil test results. Lime is also usually applied using a spreader. If it's not incorporated into the soil, not only will the lime have a harder time giving the benefit of raising the pH, but your soil pH is really only going to increase in the top 2 inches. So your 2 inches might be at an optimal level, but anything below 2 inches is not going to be at an optimal pH, which is going to increase the stress of the plants that you're trying to grow because they're going to not be growing in the optimal environment. The soil test results will give you a recommendation for lime. Even though we say that the recommendation, you want your lime to be between 6 and 7 for most crops, I think the recommendation is that they usually don't say you should apply lime if your soil pH is just below 6, because it's a waste of your time and it's a waste of your inputs. So now, to finish up our presentation, we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about soil testing. A soil test, like we had mentioned before, will tell you if your nutrient levels are too low or too high for the crop that you're trying to grow. The results will also provide lime and fertilizer recommendations based on the crop that you are trying to grow and the crop that you tell the soil test lab that you are trying to grow. This is a free service through West Virginia University for West Virginia residents. The only cost associated to you is the postage to mail it to Morgantown. So when we talk about making sure your soil is properly dried before we mail it in, that's not only because it makes it easier for the lab to get those results back to you quicker, because you're not having to wait for the soil to dry, but you're also not paying for wet soil, and that's a considerable cost that would be passed on to you if your soil is not dry before you mail it into the lab. A soil test is going to tell you the following. It's going to give you your soil pH and give you a lime recommendation, and it's also going to give you the levels of 4 main nutrients. Your phosphorus and your potassium that we had mentioned were macronutrients, primary macronutrients, and your calcium and magnesium. And these are 2 secondary macronutrients that we use, like we had just talked about with the lime, to decide if your calcium and magnesium levels are adequate, and you can use those levels to make a decision on what type of lime you need to use, if any. You'll probably notice that nitrogen is not on this list because we do not test for soil nitrogen through the WVU lab. It's very difficult to extract soil nitrogen. It likes to move freely throughout the soil. It's hard to get a fine reading on exactly how much is there. So it's not only very difficult, but it also is costly. If you're really interested in how much nitrogen is in your soil, there are a number of private labs that will do it for a fee for you. But this soil testing is free for West Virginia residents, and it's a service that I highly advocate every West Virginia farmer takes advantage of. Another benefit to soil testing, you can test for your soil organic matter. That does come with an additional fee. It costs $5. But the lab will also tell you what percentage of your soil is organic matter. And for growing crops, we want it to be around 5%. Every little bit that you raise that organic matter helps with your water holding capacity. It helps retain your soil nutrients, as well as a wide other host of benefits that we see. Now moving on to taking a soil sample, and it's important that this is done correctly because your soil test is only going to be as good as the sample that you mail in. So the first thing you're going to need to do is obviously dig a hole, and you'll notice that once you first break open the ground, that soil is going to want to flip over like a lid. It's easiest to take a soil sample. You don't want the soil to be too wet, and you don't want the soil to be too dry. A healthy soil is going to hold a little bit moisture even if it hasn't rained, but if the soil is too dry, you are really not going to get a good sample. You're only going to be able to get your shovel in maybe a few inches before it just refuses to go any further because the soil is just too dry to be worked up with a shovel. We don't really want to take a sample from this hole that you see here on the screen. The best way to get a good soil sample is to back your shovel up another inch or two and then take a nice even cross section from the hole that you just dug. It's just a little bit more of a cleaner sample. You get a little bit more soil this way, and it's easier to pull out those roots, those grasses, the rock, the plant debris, and everything else. So then when you can then replace that little lid of soil back onto the ground. You want to keep that soil covered and take the little bit that you got out of that particular area and leave it to be mixed in for when you take your next sample, because you will need to take multiple over one particular area in order to get a good sample. This is a really common question when it comes to soil testing. How deep should I really be taking a soil sample? For gardens and tilled land that's used for agronomic crops like corn or soybeans, 6 inches is really the best depth. That's deep enough where the roots are really making their home, and it gives a pretty accurate representation of what nutrients are in the soil. For no-till agriculture land, the recommendation is 1 test for the top 2 inches and 1 test for the bottom 2 inches. The reason being because those 2 different depths have the soil reacts just a little bit differently, as we're not disturbing that land for the growing season. For pastures and lawns, you can go a little bit more shallow. Grasses don't need as much rooting depth as, say, a tomato crop or a corn plant might. So 2 to 4 inches for a pasture, or 4 inches for a lawn is really a sound recommendation to get a good sample. The frequency of testing your soil is also a vital point to make for your gardens and your other agricultural land. Every year or every other year is typically good enough. Those types of crops often deplete nutrients from the soil at a faster rate than a pasture or lawn, so to really make sure that your crops are getting what they need, testing your soil every year or every other year is the best way to do so. Again, the service is free through West Virginia University, so I advocate that everybody takes advantage of this. For pastures and lawns, they don't have as more demanding nutrient needs as your gardens or your other ag land might, so if you are not up to the task every year, every other year, every 1 to 4 years is the recommendation that we make with the grasslands. So there's really 5 main steps to taking a soil test. We had just gone over how to take the sample. In order to, from taking that sample to mailing it into the lab, there's a few additional steps that you'll need to take. You'll want to take multiple samples across the area to be tested. So for example, if you have a pasture field, you'll want to go across that field and take more than just 1 sample. Because again, your soil test results are only as good as the sample you take in. Soil varies very heavily across even just a small area. So taking multiple samples gets a sort of average for your land, which gives you more of an average recommendation for the nutrients that you're then able to apply in order to bring your soil health back up to an optimum level. Once you take all of your samples, and there's no really scientific method you need to do across that field. Some people will just take random samples, some people will move in a zigzag, some people will take more of a systematic approach to it, but there's no right or wrong way to take them, but it is important that you do take multiple samples. You want to put all those samples into a bucket, mix them all together, make sure all those rocks, fruits, and other plant debris have been removed and set aside, and then the soil that's left in the bucket, you'll want to let that air dry. You can do that outside. If you have an airy room in your home, feel free to let that lay it out and let it dry. You do not want to use heat to make this sample dry. It's really important that it's just dried naturally. While it's drying, you'll notice that the soil forms natural little clods. You can break those up because they'll need that for the lab anyway, and it'll help speed up the process once your sample is received in Morgantown. Before you're getting ready to mail it in, you'll want to fill out the soil test form, and I'll provide the web address to obtain that. It's just ask for your information, your name, your address, your county, your email address. That's how you'll receive the results. And it also asks for exactly what you're using this land for. So if it's a pasture, they're going to give you fertilizer and lime recommendations for a pasture field. If it's a vegetable garden, they're going to tailor your results to a vegetable garden, and so on and so forth. When you're getting ready to mail that in, you only need to fill up 1 to 2 cups of dried soil. Just a normal Ziploc bag would work. They don't need any more than that. Don't forget to include that completed form to the soil test lab. If that soil is already dried for the lab, you already have your form filled out correctly, and you only send in a little bit of sample, the turnaround time is about 2 weeks between when it gets to the lab to when you get your results. That time frame does fluctuate a little bit. Everybody's taking a soil test around the same time, getting ready for the growing season in early spring. So do be patient with the lab, but you will get your results. In order to get that soil test form, you can visit the web address that I have highlighted on the screen, soiltesting.wvu.edu. From there you can also get mailing instructions, and it does provide more information on how to take a soil sample, how often to sample, how deep to sample, and any other questions you might have about the process leading up to mailing the sample into the lab. Again, the results do take about 2 weeks. Your county extension agent will receive a copy of your soil test results, so if you have any questions about what the results are telling you, you can feel free to call them, or any questions regarding the recommendations, they can help you answer those as well. When you download the form, this is what it looks like. Like I said before, it is important that you do complete that. It helps the lab out a great deal. On the latter half of the page, under the dotted line where it says sample data, you'll see date the soil was sampled, the area that you had sampled, whether it's in acres or square feet, as well as the crop codes. Now this is really the most important part, because in order to give you the best recommendations for what to do with your soil, the lab needs to know exactly what you're trying to grow. The nutrient requirements for alfalfa are a great deal different than what you need to grow a vegetable patch, for example. So make sure that you do fill that out, as well as the rest of the information on this page. This is an example of what it's going to look like, especially that colorful bar there in the middle of the page gives you the pH. You can see on this particular soil test results it was 7.3, which was fairly close to neutral. It's a good pH. Your phosphorus in P2O5, you can see the levels are very high, as well as your potassium, represented as K2O there on this lab test results, also very high, and the calcium and the magnesium. Down towards the bottom of the page, you can see where it says recommendation for crop. This particular person had listed home gardens, and at the top you can see that their previous crop was tomatoes. Again, since the soil test lab does not test for nitrogen, they provide a recommendation for nitrogen based on what your previous crop would have taken out of the soil. 2 pounds per square feet is a pretty blanket recommendation. It's usually just enough. It's not a very high amount, but it's usually just enough to replenish nitrogen back into the soil, as nitrogen is usually the element that's the most depleted and the most essential for plant growth. Since the phosphorus and the potassium levels were listed as very high, it's not giving any recommendation. The lab results have indicated that this soil is perfectly fine without any phosphorus or potassium additives for the next season. At the very bottom, there's a long list of suggestions regarding the pH and a little bit of some recommendations on how to calculate fertilizer test results. Again, that's more than our capabilities of this webinar today to really get into, but your county agent can really help you if you're having trouble figuring out a sound fertilizer results for your particular soil and your particular farm. It gives a couple other recommendations which are very helpful to read through regarding various crops, and if your soil levels are at a certain height, you might want to avoid salt effects, and it gives a little bit of a recommendation on how to maintain your soil health on that aspect. If you have any questions regarding this presentation or soil health in general, you can visit extension.wvu.edu to find your local extension office. Every county in West Virginia has an extension agent that is available to answer questions regarding farming or any of our other program areas. If you have specific questions about soil health, I'd also be happy to answer them. My email was listed at the beginning of the webinar. But from here, I would like to wish everybody that's watching this the best of luck in starting their farming operations and for continuing the agriculture tradition here in West Virginia. Thank you.